first thank the Carson Center for the opportunity to talk today, for the wonderful and also, I think, unique experience that the fellowships provide. So thanks to Christoph Helmuth for creating a melting pot of people and their backgrounds and ideas that coming together in really unusual ways, I think. Thanks also to the support staff and other staff members who couldn't have been more helpful with supporting transition into Munich life and life at the centre. And thanks to fellows, as Arnab said, recently, and visiting scholars for collegiality, food and drink. I can't remember who mentioned that first. It might have been Ernst, but all the eating and drinking and exchange of ideas has been great. The presentation I'll give today is from a very new project which I'm only just beginning work on, and it's already been enriched and shaped by the experience of being here. So, one of the consequences of the pervasive environmental change we're currently experiencing, and which is so much a hallmark of our times, is a widespread call to do things and think about things differently. We're also required to imagine things differently. Everything from energy and agricultural systems, how we build and inhabit our cities, our habits and responsibilities as consumers, to how economies and politics works, mass movements constitute and mobilise themselves, not to mention reassessments of modernisation and capitalism. So in amongst all this, the example I want to focus on today is the call from within certain science and humanities fields to develop new forms of dialogue and exchange with one another. So this is a move that is future-directed in that it hopes passionately, in many instances, to develop more effective responses to pressing environmental problems. Crucially, these efforts aim to communicate between, draw upon and integrate the two disciplinary domains, so that is the humanities and sciences, that are so often, as historian Tom Griffiths puts it, separated in our training and thinking. For example, global change and global sustainability sciences are now inviting the humanities, at least in principle, into shared research frameworks. Meanwhile, humanities scholars, notably in the field of the rapidly expanding environmental humanities, hope to make their work more relevant to the world of science and policy. There have been mixed responses to this turn of events. Some see it as a uniquely promising moment where scientists and humanists turn toward one another with a shared sense of gratitude as they recognise the limits of their respective knowledge systems. Others refer more cautiously to a fraught flirtation between the disciplines, and still others, conspicuously the geographer Noel Castry, have mounted strenuous critiques of this recent turn. He applauds its general intentions, but suggests that both the environmental humanities and the sciences need to expand their limited conception of one another's fields. They each need to, he argues, to abandon entrenched disciplinary habits and closed-circle audiences in order to achieve the new kinds of dialogue they aspire to. At the very least, as Sverker Solin suggests, there are a few roadmaps to show the way forward. So what I want to do today is, first of all, outline some examples of these calls for more exchange between the two fields. I'll focus on the example of global change science and emphasise that the proposed inclusion of the humanities marks an important shift in this field. And then we'll take an extremely brief excursion into the world of contemporary public environmental art to introduce the theme of making visible the kinds of phenomena that lack immediately tangible or visible form. And I'll conclude by asking, what does Rachel Carson have to do with any of this? As many people in this room will know, Carson's book Silent Spring, first published in 1962, played a vital role in catalysing and focusing public concern with pollution and public health. This concern led to tangible legislative initiatives in North America, such as the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, and some suggest also the Endangered Species Act. Carson is frequently claimed as a central figure propelling and shaping the modern environmental movement. So here you can see a more recent copy of Silent Spring from the library here at the Carson Center, with the front cover declaration that this book launched the environmental movement. Carson was a maverick but private and retiring figure, a scientist-writer with a training in marine biology, who in the latter part of her career worked without institutional affiliation. As a female scientist during a period when only 1% of tenured scientists in America were women, Carson worked outside what Rob Nixon calls the structures and strictures of the university. He calls her extra-institutional. She became, through Silent Spring's indictment of DDT and other synthetic chemicals, a scientist, activist, writer and public intellectual. And what I want to suggest today is that there are many good reasons in the context I've just outlined regarding this sort of turning towards one another of the humanities and sciences, for turning to unorthodox figures such as Carson, with her insistence on fusing imagination and creativity with scientific fact. She was able to wed the two cultures of science and literature. For anyone unfamiliar with C.P. Snow's much-cited Reed lecture delivered in 1959 at Cambridge, I'm alluding here to his strident and influential critique of what he called the mutual incomprehension displayed between mid-20th century scientists and the arts, most particularly the literary world. The two cultures, he observed, had almost ceased to communicate at all. Carson's body of work, including 3 books about the sea published before Silent Spring, bridged these two worlds. Further, she managed across the body of her work to radically shift some of her most dearly held assumptions about both nature and science. This process of self-reflection and self-examination and her reconceptualisation of what she called the old ideas resulted in her 4th and last and most influential book, which is Silent Spring. In our current climate that calls for acts of rethinking and reimagining our relationships with and responsibilities to intertwine natural, cultural and social worlds, this capacity of hers to shift both her thinking and her narrative strategies bears closer examination. And I'll return to these themes shortly. But first, back to the question of where more specifically are these calls for new kinds of collaborations coming from. In terms of the sciences, key examples emerge from the world of what is called global change science through initiatives such as Future Earth Rescue and I Hope. As a term, global change here refers to changes in the Earth system that affect continents, oceans, atmosphere, and the life forms they support. This field of science emerged during the 1980s through major international research programs and has played a vital role in recognising that alterations to biophysical systems are driven in significant part by human activities. The field has played an equally vital role in disseminating its findings and alerting broader audiences to the scale and effect of human impacts. you can easily recognise through the titles and acronyms I've just mentioned, so Future Earth, I Hope, Rescue, the normative dimensions of these programs. They aim to affect change and to make a difference in the world. So Rescue, states, this is a program that ran between 2009 and 2011, and it states that some of its key aims in terms of fostering new forms of interdisciplinarity in these ways. And I Hope expresses its aims in these ways, and I'm just passing through these examples very quickly. And I'll focus now a little more detail on Future Earth. So Future Earth is a 10-year international global change and global sustainability research program which was launched in 2012. Close observers note that it will set sustainability debates over the coming years and decade. It builds on 3 decades of developments in Earth system science and grows out of particular what are called global environmental change programs, which are listed here. The International Geosphere Biosphere Program, or IGBP, is one of the most high profile of these predecessor programs. According to Johan Rockström, the IGBP was the first major international program to conceptualise Earth as a whole system. It's also generated key, influential and deliberately provocative concepts, which many of you here today will be familiar with. So the Anthropocene, the Great Acceleration and planetary boundaries, all terms and concepts that have proliferated well beyond scientific circles. In comparison to these predecessor programs, Future Earth signals an intention to place far more emphasis on human values, institutions, habits, ethics and behaviours, and aims to forge what it calls a new social contract between science and society. So the gesture towards the humanities is part of this overarching aim of Future Earth. It's worth noting here that global change science has been marked since its inception precisely by a history of interdisciplinarity. The evolution of Earth system science as a nascent discipline in the mid-1980s involved drawing together knowledge from the earth and life sciences, also known as the physical and biological sciences. The physical, geological and meteorological sciences had already developed an integrated international science at this point in time, meaning that the life sciences were, at this stage, the newcomers or the Johnny-come-latelys. Interaction between global change and social scientists, and here I'm distinguishing between social sciences and humanities, in global change research also stretches back, not without its difficulties, to the same period, so the 1980s. And because of time, I won't go into detail. In contrast, as a 2009 article co-authored by anthropologist Deborah Bird-Rose, historian Libby Robin and climate scientist Will Steffen, among others, points out, interaction between the sciences and humanities in sustainability research has, on the whole, they say, been minimal. Geographer Noel Castry and co-authors phrases a similar point slightly differently in a 2014 article, where they suggest that the work of environmental humanities and social sciences, here grouped together, has, quote, so far registered weakly among both physical scientists and many non-academic constituencies. Bronislaw Szynski, who visited here just a few weeks ago through the invitation of Ursula, I'm not sure if she's here, and who some of the PhD students, I think, will be familiar with, concurs with this prognosis, stating that in the developing analysis of this new global environmental risk, this has been a science-first transformation of understanding. So the point I'm trying to stress here is that the call to integrate the humanities as part of a suite of research strategies within these kind of broad-scale international programs, such as Future Earth, is a very recent and also unprecedented turn in that field of global change research. Needless to say, and I won't go into this here again because of time, the question of how the humanities are conceived by global change science remains a fraught one, as does the question of what role the humanities might conceivably play in this context. Researchers from within the rescue initiative I showed on the slide a moment ago participated in a working group committed to addressing the question of how to intensify, as they put it, the discourse between natural and physical sciences and social and human sciences. One of their key findings, according to Karen O'Brien and others, was that this challenge can only be addressed through what they call changes in people's beliefs and mindsets. To overcome resistance to such transformative change, they argue, requires exploring one's own individual and collective assumptions, which often involves confronting existing priorities, interests, habits and loyalties that can be threatened by processes of change. So they advocate a kind of examination of the problems as much as the solutions. And I'll return to this point in relation to Rachel Carson in a moment. When I was preparing this talk, I looked back over the Future Earth website, and it's striking that one of the few tangible examples of the new kinds of collaborative forms being proposed, so apart from the science to science and science to social science examples, is in the realm of the creative arts. So here is a piece of public art which is up on their website, produced through a collaboration between artist David Usher and climate scientist Damon Matthews. It's a light projection that was played across the surface of a multi-storey wall in Montreal on Earth Day this year. It's a clock that counts down the years, months, days, milliseconds to when the planet will have warmed by 2 degrees because of climate change, and here projected to be in 28 years' time as of this year's Earth Day. I was going to try and play it, but I didn't want to attempt the technology. So this thing counts down, the CO2 levels go up, the time counts down. And this is where I'll take an extremely short detour to some of my earlier work, a recent book called Curating Sydney that Evelyn mentioned, co-authored with Jill Bennett. And we examine these kinds of public art projects that engage with sustainability issues and use the idea of public art curating the city, relying on the definition of curate meaning to care for, rather than its more usual definition as the selection of particular objects for exhibition in a museum or gallery. So the countdown clock that we just saw might be seen as part of a growing body of public artworks that incorporate data visualisation, sometimes but not always with participatory elements to engage audiences with environmental topics, and to also, in theory at least, to invite civic engagement and invite certain kinds of publics to form around them. So here's just a few examples, and I won't discuss them in detail, but this is a piece of work called Amphibian Architecture, the American artist Natalie Jeremijenko played a key role on this piece, and these floating buoys have sensors beneath the water to sense passing fish. And you can also throw these pieces of food to them to bind heavy metals out of the fish systems. This is a piece by Digital Urban Living that registered CO2 levels at 3 different sites in Sydney. And this is a piece called Building Run, which visualised data to do with these big sort of inner city buildings, and their energy efficiency metrics were sort of turned into these avatars that sped up as they use more energy, slowed down as they use less. And there are many other examples I could have given. So a strong theme in these works is that of giving form to phenomena that otherwise tend to remain invisible and intangible. So levels of carbon dioxide in the air around us, pollutant levels in our urban rivers, shifts in temperature at a global scale rather than at the immediately local and sensible scale. Which brings us back to Rachel Carson. Here she is. Rob Nixon suggests that in Silent Spring, Carson traded the lyrical voice of her earlier books with the celebration of marine life for the voice of what he calls Elegy and Apocalypse. One of her key achievements, he notes, was her ability to shape narrative around what he calls amorphous menace. Her subjects of what he calls biomagnification and toxic drift lacked immediately tangible or visible form, and so posed, he writes, formidable imaginative difficulties for writers and activists alike. It's this shift in register between the earlier and later work, the trading of voices, that I'd like to focus on today. Literary critic Lawrence Beudel notes that today Carson is better known for Silent Spring than for her first 3 books, which he describes as evocatively descriptive prose poems that approach their subjects of the sea as an intricate green world of beautiful integrity beyond the harmful reach of human activity. But they are also much more than this. They are a celebration as much of scientific knowledge as they are of the sea. From her first book, Under the Sea Wind, which was first published in 1941, from this point onwards, Carson insisted on a very particular fusion of science and imagination. Her method consisted of what she called keeping on solid scientific ground, wedded to a synthesising and also a visualising sensibility. Speaking of her studies at the famous Marine Biological Laboratory at Woods Hole in Massachusetts, Carson wrote in 1941, probably that was when I first began to let my imagination go down through the water and piece together bits of scientific fact until I could see the whole life of these sea creatures as they lived them in the strange sea world. The eel was for her a central figure during the period. She had studied eels in the laboratory at Johns Hopkins University, and in her written work followed the eel imaginatively into what she described as the deep Atlantic abyss. So I'm just using this particular example. There are many more of them, of her capacity to engage imaginative and very visually. To me, she wrote in a memo reflecting on the production of her first book, to see an eel is something like meeting a person who has travelled to the most remote and wonderful places of the earth. In a flash, I see a vivid picture of the strange places that eel has been, places which I, being merely human, can never visit. This is just that earlier quote I mentioned about her imagination tied to scientific fact. This combination of direct observation, careful research, allegiance to biological accuracy, and vivid imagination of places and phenomena beyond immediate human sensory experience continued in her best-selling book, The Sea Around Us, which launched her literary career in earnest and won her fame as a scientifically serious nature writer. So this is just another example of the way she bound accuracy with observation and imagination. And this was the book that became the bestseller and really shifted her literary career. Carson's biographer, Linda Lear, notes that it took Carson 10 years to synthesise the findings in the field of oceanography that inform this book. Carson's imagination again went down beneath the water, this time to visualise topography of the seafloor, deep time of geology, tectonic shifts and underwater volcanoes, planetary patterns of wind, waves and currents. The scale of her subject and her handling of it mean that Carson escapes literary critic Ursula Heiss's charge that too much American nature writing is focused on place, that is, favoured locales, resonant sites and bioregions at the expense of a more expansive understanding of interlocking systems at a global scale that the Anthropocene might demand. The Sea Around Us is not only a celebration of the sea and its mysteries, it is a celebration of American post-war scientific and technological developments that provided new insights into the workings of the ocean, portrayed by Carson as one of the Earth's last great knowledge frontiers. Of her first book, so the one I mentioned earlier, Under the Sea Wind, Carson wrote, the ocean is too big and vast and its sources are too mighty to be much affected by human activity. For this reason, she decided that the author as a person or human observer, as she puts it, should never enter the story. Humans are largely absent from her narrative, which focuses instead on sea creatures, including this eel that I mentioned. In The Sea Around Us, however, people now appear. They are largely scientists engaging with and unravelling the mysteries of the sea in as far as they're able. She cites a wide range of scientists and other experts, from 19th century naturalist explorers to the most contemporary of oceanographers. But by the late 1950s, at work on a manuscript then provisionally titled Man Against Nature, which was to become Silent Spring, she commented on a significant shift that had occurred in her thinking. And I'm now moving into conclusion mode here. So, writing to her intimate friend Dorothy Friedman in 1958, Carson observed, and I know it's taboo not to put huge slabs of text in PowerPoint slides, but I couldn't resist in this instance. So she writes here in this letter, I suppose my thinking began to be affected soon after atomic science was firmly established. Some of the thoughts that came were so unattractive to me that I rejected them completely, for the old ideas die hard, especially when they are emotionally as well as intellectually dear to me. It was pleasant to believe, for example, that much of nature was forever beyond the tampering reach of man. He might level the forests and dam the streams, but the clouds and the rain and the wind were beyond his reach. I have now opened my eyes and my mind, she writes. I may not like what I see, but it does no good to ignore it. And it's worse than useless to go on repeating the old eternal verities that are no more eternal than the hills of the poets. So she was able to effect here the kind of change in her own thinking that Karen O'Brien from the Rescue Program, who I quoted earlier, argues is essential to addressing what she and her co-authors describe as the challenges presented by a dualistic worldview that separates nature from human culture. In other words, she displays an ability to not only confront, this is Carson, but also shift her own assumptions and dearly held loyalties. And it was this change that led to the formation of Silent Spring and its efficacy in the real world I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. Her approach, as Nixon and other scholars have argued, helped hasten the shift from a conservationist ideology to a more socio-environmental outlook that has, among other things, as Nixon argues, proven so enabling for the environmental justice movements. Further, through tracing the passage of toxic chemicals through water, soil, atmosphere, food, human and non-human bodies, Carson articulated an enmeshment of the environment inside the human body with that of the broader external environment. In Silent Spring, nature is firmly networked and bound in dynamic ecological relationships to human bodies through industrial, agricultural, food and water systems. In her final book, too, the timeless eternities of nature conveyed in her earlier work, the sea, nature now resides in suburban backyards and everyday lives. Thank you.